Hey there, welcome back and thanks for sticking around for week 3. I'm really hungry, so I'm going to prep my breakfast while we talk. We've already gone over heating food and holding food, so now we're going to back up and talk about the oldest technology we have relating to food, the knife. And yes, that was how you pronounced it up into the 17th century. I could use some pepper. We'll talk about grinding too. Some of the oldest human artifacts are knives. In fact, they're pre-human, dating back to 2.6 million years ago. Modern-day chimps possess knife-making skills, hammering rocks with other rocks to sharpen them. Hence, knives were central to food even before cooking was. Besides being so basic an implement, knives remind us of the interconnections between our kitchen and military histories, used both for the meat of our prey and for the meat of our competitors. By medieval times, cooks would chop, slice, and debone at long tables using a variety of implements. Knives took all different sorts of forms: to chop, bone, fillet. One of the now rarely seen kitchen arts is turning, carving vegetables into regular shapes for pretty much just aesthetic purposes, although theoretically they could cook more evenly or something. If you want to nerd out over the plethora of different knives, you should check out Tim Hayward's book, Knife, and just hear his sheer awe over the tool. By medieval times, knife sharpeners would wander through the streets, only a few minutes for a modest set. Table knives were not set out at meals, but rather one's own personal knives for the joint purposes of defense, eating, and anything else that might come up. Men and women alike carried their own knives and would scarce think to borrow someone else's. Yuck. And if they were rich, the hilts would be ornately carved and jeweled. Knives were prized possessions. From stone, knives evolved into copper and bronze, which, Science Me, could you take it from here? Yep, I said we'd do a little more on material properties. Copper and bronze are soft metals, which means that they're easy to extract and they're easy to shape into sharp blades, but they're also easy to shape out of sharp blades, i.e. they don't hold up to tough use. Iron, by contrast, is very hard, but very brittle, so instead of deforming, it breaks. In mechanics of materials, we describe this with a stress-strain curve. So this is a stress-strain curve, or rather several stress-strain curves. Stress is the amount of force that you're putting onto the material, and strain is the amount that it's deforming as a result. So this is the curve for copper. You can see that it deforms a lot. Bronze deforms even more, which allows it to withstand a higher stress. Notice it's the tallest, but these are both soft, right? So they're gonna change shape easily. Iron is this little buddy hanging out in here. It's not gonna want to deform at all, so it just breaks. Steel, this is 0.2% steel. So all we did was add 0.2% carbon to that iron, and whoop, all of a sudden, we're still not deforming a lot, but we can take a lot more stress before it breaks. So that's the power of steel and why we use it for so many things, including for our knives. Yeah, so steel's cool, and it was industrialized in the 1700s, but we're still talking before stainless steel. So it stains, which means it reacts with the food. And it's not just the knife that's affected, it's the food, which can take on a certain metallic tang, which easily overpowers delicate flavors such as fish, hence silverfish knives. Half of the technological advances surrounding knives are centered around making them better at cutting, but the other half are all about making them worse at cutting. Knives are dangerous, and when you have a big drunken feast, things can get out of hand. Table knives emerged from the need to reduce mealtime menace. Rounded tips, less sharp, only really usable for soft foods. And that's why we hold knives with that delicate pointer finger on top instead of the previous dagger grip. We'll talk a little more about table manners in the next video, as well as how our use of table knives affects the physical structures of our jaws. But for now, I want to move on to grinding. I keep saying this, but grinding was an important technology that rendered edible many previously inedible foods. Or I should say more like indigestible. Tough, fibrous roots, husk grains that our body would be hard put to obtain calories from otherwise. And don't forget about sugar and coffee, and bread and cake and anything else that uses flour. The very first grinding technology is the quern. One flat stone pounds relentlessly against another flat stone until whatever's between them is ground to bits. Gradually, you transition through different shapes and motions until you get to the rotary quern. Much more efficient. Alongside querns, you have mortars and pestles, which have basically remained unchanged since the Stone Age. By Roman times, we had water-powered grain mills. By the year 1000, we had windmills. But through this time, commercially ground products were expensive. Coarser bread was considered inferior and only suitable for manual laborers. In medieval times, the fineness of your bread signaled your class, as did the amount of spices you could afford, also usually ground. By the way, side note, fresh ground salt isn't actually a thing. Fresh ground pepper makes sense because you release all those aromatic compounds that would waft away otherwise. But salt's just salt. It's the same thing. The typical household would have to grind their own flour in a small mortar pestle, small batch at a time. Or I should say the typical housewife would have to. Since early times, grinding was the work of women. Ancient female skeletons bear arthritis in the lower limbs that's thought to be linked to kneeling over a quern and rocking the stone back and forth. Some women were even buried with their stones, symbol of their eternal grind. Maybe it's this delegation of labor that caused grinding technology to advance so slowly. Poor women enslaved didn't tend to be in the position to invent or buy labor-saving devices, and people who were in that position didn't tend to care. This nonchalance over labor can be seen in recipes that recommend grinding or beating long enough to tire one person or two. It wasn't until the late 1800s in the US when labor-saving culinary devices hit their boom. Suddenly there were potato mashers, egg beaters, and lots of grinding machines. But an interesting thing about new technology, often advances don't actually reduce the amount of work done. When fires became easier to control and containers became cheaper to buy, cooks didn't just make easier and cheaper versions of the previous one-pot meals. Instead, they added courses, glazes, and sides that had to be kept separate. The more labor-saving devices appearing in kitchens, the more housewives and cooks found other ways to do more work, albeit maybe not as physically destructive as the old querns. Wow, I could talk about this with you all day, but I have other things to do. So back to the grind. We've gone over the history of cutting, how personal an item one's knife once was, art in soft metals, why it helps to add a pinch of carbon to your iron, grinding, and why advances in technology depend on who it is that cares. For our episode on eating, we'll touch again on knife manners, as well as the development of your other table implements, the spoon and the fork. Like, subscribe, stay sharp, and I'll see you next week.